Okay, chapter 4, last section here. Paul's going to talk about Hagar and Sarah, and he's going to give an example as an allegory. He says, "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman." So this allegory comes from Genesis chapters 16 and 17. We should go there now and take a look at this so we know what he's talking about. Verse 1 in Genesis 16. "Now Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar." That's the slave Paul's talking about. "And Sarah said to Abram, 'Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. So go to my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her.' And Abram listened to the voice of Sarah." So remember, God had promised that Abram would have these kids and this land. And if you remember the promises of God to Abram, but none of it was happening. So we see that they take matters into their own hands and try to make it happen. And that's exactly what Paul's saying. So Abram and Sarah, it's impossible for them to have kids. They try to make it happen. Hagar was the slave woman that Paul's referring to, and she becomes part of the allegory here. Ishmael, her son, born to her through Abram, is representative of slavery. And think about it, he's also representative of trying to take God's promises into your own hands and try to force it and make it happen by your own work. Now, Genesis 17. So then later on, God says to Abraham, "As for Sarah your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be your name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her." And then Abram fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, "Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" He couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe that. Remember, at this point, Abraham had already had Ishmael, and he most likely thought Ishmael was the child of the promise. In fact, he says there in verse 18, Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." In other words, haven't we already been through this? Isn't Ishmael that child you promised? And God is saying, no, actually, I'm going to give you a child through Sarah, even though she's so old at this point. That's exactly what happened. God made it happen. Sarah, his wife, had the son Isaac, and Isaac represents freedom. He also represents, if you think about it, Isaac represents trusting in God to keep his promises. Paul talks about that in Romans chapter 4. He says, "Abraham did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb." Paul here in Romans 4 is talking about Genesis chapter 17. He says, "But Abraham grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised." And so this is exactly the allegory that Paul is referring to now in Galatians chapter 4. And he goes on and he talks about the two Jerusalems, and he extends the allegory. He says, Hagar represents Mount Sinai, and she corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. So think about it. At the time of this writing, the present Jerusalem was in bondage. They were under Roman rule. And he says in verse 26, "But the Jerusalem above, heavenly Jerusalem, is free, and she is our mother." And he's talking about, of course, referring to Isaac and the child of the promise. So Hagar represents the present Jerusalem in bondage, and Sarah represents the heavenly Jerusalem, which is free. And so why don't you hit pause now that we're done with chapter 4 and talk a little bit about this in your own life, and we'll see you in the next chapter.